My name is Lucas. Once this name sounded proud. It was pronounced with respect, with a slight tremor, because behind it stood strength and authority. Now it is worthless. Just a set of letters, which is called an old man who drags his feet along the street and hinders the haste of the younger ones. I live on the outskirts of a town, in a small house that is more like a shell, empty, from which everyone turns away. Here once sounded the laughter of my children, the bustle of my wife, the smell of fresh bread and coffee. And now, silence. Dead, deaf, stretched silence that eats away at the bones. Sometimes it is so oppressive that I catch myself thinking, do I really still exist? My children. They are successful. Everyone has a job, a new car, a family, a circle of friends. They often talk about me, but not with me. The phone rings rarely, and when it does, it's only to make sure I don't forget to pay some utility bill or sign a piece of paper. Their voices have a cold politeness, like those of people fulfilling a duty to a stranger. Their eyes have long since lost the sparkle they once had when they looked at me with trust. My grandchildren, they're even more cruel. Young, hot, confident in their impunity. For them, I'm a drag, a shadow of the past. When they come, they hide their phones in their palms and wearily mutter words through their teeth. I don't need their toys or attention, but every "Grandpa, leave me alone" cuts harder than a knife. I see in their faces a reflection of my children's indifference. And it's not their fault, it's my punishment. In the store, they look at me as a problem. I stand at the counter, trying to make out the small print on the package, and the saleswoman is already sighing, rolling her eyes, as if I'm taking up her time. There's always someone in the queue behind me who will start muttering, "How much longer?" I hide my hands in my pockets so they don't tremble. And I'm silent. Always silent. They can't hear me in the hospital. The young doctor speaks quickly, coldly, as if I'm a mechanism that has worked its way through. He doesn't look me in the eye, he's leafing through papers. You don't have to. This phrase is heard so often that I'm starting to feel as if my body has already been crossed off the list of the living. Isolation. That's the most accurate word. I'm alive, but already isolated from everything. Invisible in my own city, in my own house. When I go out into the street, I see people walking past me without stopping to look. It's as if I'm a ghost who hasn't yet learned to accept his death. And yet, I remember. In the depths of my memory, I still see the Lucas I was, a man of his word, a man who was sought after, revered. But now something else is awakening in me, rot, shadow, darkness. It's eroding my patience, eating into my bones. Every cold look, every disregard is a crumb falling into the empty chest of resentment. And this chest is almost full. When I sit by the window in the evenings, looking at the lights of the neighboring houses, it becomes clear to me, they forgot me while I was still alive. I'm no longer a person, I'm a burden, a fragment of the past that for some reason still breathes. But I feel that this indifference is not the end. Something else is being born in me. Indistinct, dark, silent. Something that's waiting for its moment. I often return to the past. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Otherwise, I will simply disappear. The past is the last thing that holds me by the throat, reminds me that I once was. I remember my first steps in business. Young, bold, in a tattered shirt, without money, but with eyes that burned so that people believed me before I even opened my mouth. I could convince anyone. I could lift those who had already fallen to their feet. I was not afraid of risk, because I knew that everything I do makes sense. I built my business from scratch. The first small office was in a semi-basement with peeling walls. There, amidst the smell of dampness, my first deals were born. I remember how I sat over papers at night, and during the day I smiled in front of people, as if I did not feel exhausted. And all this was not for money. Money was always just a means. I wanted power. I wanted my word to count. And I achieved it. Over time, I became the person they went to for advice, for support. My name was a watchword in the city. I was the rock against which the waves crashed. I held my family on me like a foundation holds a house. Children. I saw them grow up in the abundance that I earned with sweat and blood. I gave them the best. I taught them that honesty and honor are more important than easy victories. Every decision I made was for them. Every sleepless night, every risk, every loss. I wanted them to never know the hunger and powerlessness that I knew. But children grow up, and their memory is short. What was a sacrifice for me, for them is ordinary. They took everything for granted. Success seemed natural to them, as if it grew by itself. They didn't see the wounds on my hands, they didn't hear the nightly groans when I fell into a chair from exhaustion. My wife, she was my light. She believed in me, even when I thought I was an adventurer doomed to fail. Her hands kept me from falling, her eyes made me go forward. But light doesn't last forever. She left first. And from that day on, I began to age. Real aging is not wrinkles, but the absence of those for whom you lived. I remember the funeral. Black umbrellas, wet soil, and me standing like a rock. Everyone expected strength from me, and I gave it. But inside I died that day. I just didn't admit it. I plunged into work, even deeper, even more desperate, because I knew, if I stopped, I would hear my emptiness screaming. Over the years, business became for me not a challenge, but a habit. The machine I created drove itself, and my word really mattered. I remember those looks, of respect, trust, fear. People took Lucas into account. And then I believed that this would never go away. And now. I look at my hands, thin, with knots in the veins, with spots of old age. And I ask myself, where did that man they feared and respected go? Where was his voice, which could stop a quarrel with one word? Where was his back, which held his family together? I gave them everything. And I was left with nothing. Everything that was the foundation crumbled like sand. They built their lives on my sacrifices, but there was no place for me there. Sometimes I hear my wife's voice in my dreams. She says, "Lucas, you've done enough." And I wake up in an empty house and understand, no, not enough. Because if I did, I wouldn't be forgotten. The contrast between who I was and who I have become cuts me from the inside. I was pride, now I am a burden. I was light, now I am a shadow. I was a man of honor, now I am a man of silent resentment. And this resentment grows. It is no longer just pain. It becomes poison. And I feel, one day it will burst. I still try to convince myself that my children love me. But every time they come, that hope fades. "Dad, you left the light on in the hallway again." "You know, the bills are big," my son says calmly, but his voice is cold as a blade. I keep quiet, my eyes down. He doesn't see that I leave the light on not because I'm forgetful, but because I'm afraid. In the darkness, it seems to me that the walls are shrinking, and I leave the lamp on like a beacon. But he doesn't ask. He doesn't care. My daughter visits once a week. She brings groceries, but doesn't sit down at the table. She stands by the door, nervously glancing at her phone. "I'm in a hurry, Dad." She's always in a hurry. And every time I see, her visit is a duty, like a trip to the doctor. Nothing more. Grandchildren, once I asked my grandson to help take out the trash. He looked at me as if I had asked him to sell his soul. "Grandpa, you have legs. Carry me out yourself." His words hit me like a nail. And I carried me out. Bent over, with a package tearing in his hands. He didn't even take off his headphones. I felt that I was no longer in their eyes. And then there was the doctor. I was sitting in the office, my back aching, my heart beating strangely. A young man in a white coat was quickly flipping through my file. "How old are you?" He asked, not looking at me. 76, I answered. He shrugged. Well, at that age it's normal. There's no point in prescribing serious treatment. Just rest. I wanted to scream that I'm still alive, that I'm not trash. But the words got stuck in my throat. He had already opened the door, showing that the appointment was over. Each of these moments is like a tiny blow with a hammer. At first they seem like little things. But I feel it, they hit right in the heart. Little deaths. No one sees it, but I feel pieces of me chipping away and falling into the abyss. And then the diary appeared. An old, worn notebook that lay in a drawer. I opened it and wrote the first lines, sun. Light. March 12th. It was just a note, but there was more to it than a date and an event. It was a reminder. So that I wouldn't forget. So that no one would forget. The next day I added a new line, grandson. Trash. March 15th. And then another, doctor. Superiority. March 20th. I began to write down everything. Names. Events. Every little thing. It was no longer just a notebook, it became my archive of pain. Each entry throbbed inside me, like evidence, like a bone sticking out of a wound. I thought this diary would help me cleanse myself. But it did the opposite, it began to feed my resentment. I turned the pages over and over again, as if they were a book I had to memorize. And the more I read, the more I felt that I was not forgotten. I was simply set aside, like something no longer needed. And that was the difference. Forgetting is natural. But discarding, it leaves a scar. And that scar begins to burn. Every gesture, every word they make now lodges in me like a needle. I see everything. I record everything. They think I am old and blind. But I see better than ever. And I remember every little thing. My diary is getting thicker. Its pages rustle as I turn them, like a quiet laugh. I look at them and feel, this archive will become something bigger. It's no longer about my weakness. It's about my memory. And memory is strength. It happened on a normal day. I went to the store to buy a few things. A gray morning, wet asphalt, people were hurrying somewhere. I had 2 bags in my hands, heavy ones, because I decided not to bother the children and buy everything myself. When I was leaving the store, one of the bags tore. The can rolled under the feet of passers-by. I bent down, tried to pick it up, but my fingers didn't obey. The can slipped and fell again. I looked around, looking for at least someone to help. Young man, I said to the guy in the hood, pick it up, please. He didn't even stop. He just threw it over his shoulder, you handle it yourself, Grandpa. His words hit me hard. And then I heard laughter. 2 girls nearby, with phones in their hands, were looking straight at me. One said to the other, look, a little more and you'll fall. I felt my legs buckle. The can rolled again, the packages fell to the ground. People passed by, some even stopped to look. I heard quiet laughter, saw condescending looks. At that moment, something inside me snapped. Like a thread that had held a stone over an abyss for a long time, and then finally snapped. My vision blurred. I couldn't hear the noise of the street, couldn't see faces. Only the cold pouring in from within. The cold was so strong that even my hands stopped trembling. I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes before a storm. I lifted the can myself. Slowly, carefully. I lifted the packages. The laughter was still there, but now it seemed distant, as if from a dream. I walked home slowly, each step an imprint in my memory. The house was quiet. But it was no longer the same silence that had suffocated me for months. Now it had become different. Alive. It breathed with me. In this silence, I heard my new voice. Not weak and broken, but even, cold. Enough. I whispered it, but I felt the words echo off the walls. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer invisible. I was now a player. I opened my diary. The pages trembled under my fingers. I stared at the entries for a long time. Sun. Light. March 12th. Grandson. Trash. March 15th. Doctor. Arrogance. March 20, and added a new line, crowd. Laughter. March 27th. Now it was not just a list. It was a map. A plan. I sat in my chair, and I felt that my house was no longer empty. In the corners, in the walls, in the silence itself, a presence was felt. The dark part of me that I had suppressed for so long had now awakened. And it was patient. It knew, revenge is not by shouting, not by hitting. Revenge is a cold, thoughtful game. I realized, from now on, everyone who despised me will feel it. Not right away, not directly. I will not fight or scream. No. I will wait. I will build. And when they least expect it, their lives will fall apart like my package outside the store. And then they will remember my name. I know people. I know how they think, how they fear, what they are ashamed of, what their weaknesses are. This is not a gift, it is work, lived through years of negotiations, debts, calculations. When I sat at the negotiating table, I skillfully clung to the slightest crack in the proud armor of my opponent and slowly expanded it to destruction. Now I have time and silence again, and I will use them in the same way. The first step was to restore connections that seemed buried. I did not call or write. I acted quietly. Old acquaintances, one in a bar, another in an abandoned office, the third, a former partner who hid behind a small business and large loans. They remembered me not for kindness, but for strength. And strength demanded understanding, not grace. I owed some, many, they owed me. The situation allowed for a different arrangement, a polite fee, old debt papers that I still had influence over, a reminder of what could be done publicly. Their eyes shone with understanding, they knew that it was better to bargain with me than to fight. And then they became my tools, not out of compulsion, but out of logic. I didn't want a scandal. I wanted them to destroy their own lives, as if it were a series of small accidents. This is the sweetest revenge, when people believe that their problems are a coincidence, and not a planned button pressed by someone in the shadows. So I made a map, names, dates, their fears, mistakes, weakest points. New lines appeared in the diary, no longer just testimonies of grievances, but tools. Alina, credit, vulnerable 0305, Mikhailu, reputation, contact at the bank 1006, Anya, granddaughter, project, need recommendation 1807. I started to act. Small interventions, seemingly innocent. A letter to the bank with a lie about a late payment, an anonymous tip to a journalist about possible abuse at the local fund where my son worked, a phone call from an anonymous investor to my grandson asking for help in an issue that required compromise. Each of these actions was a thin thread, but when you pull them together, they began to tear apart stronger things: trust, peace, reputation. They quarreled little by little. At first it was small arguments at the table, who forgot the bill, who didn't come to the meeting. Then, louder words at family gatherings. My son accused his daughter of incompetence, my daughter replied that he was wasting resources. My grandchildren stood aside, but their gazes grew colder. They were losing their support. I sat in the shadow of my office, I did nothing with my hands, but did everything with my mind. Shame was another matter. I learned to use it as a weapon. People make mistakes, and they are afraid that their mistakes will become public. I dropped hints, subtly nudged them toward decisions that seemed safe, but left the door open. When the door opened, the world outside shone through, and the neighbors saw what had previously been hidden. This was not a dirty game of the street. No, I did not ruin people's lives with a rough hand. I put their own weakness on display, created a situation in which they themselves became their own executioners. I manipulated habits, used misunderstandings, gave people the opportunity to choose, but so that their choice always led to a fall. And the scariest thing was that I saw them start looking for the reason within themselves. This was important. When people ask, why me, they dig into their souls and find what I had highlighted to them. Then remorse comes, then they turn to each other, accuse, look for the guilty. And this destroys more than any quarrel in raised tones. I didn't do it for consolation. I didn't want to pour out my anger on ruined destinies in vain. Every step had a lesson. Respect is not permission, memory is not a resource, human dignity is not an object to throw away. I wanted them to feel what it was like to be as fragile in the eyes of others as I had been all my life. The hardest thing was to see how my actions bore fruit. It was like a painful treatment. They began to ask for help, but not from me. They treated each other with suspicion. The trust one had built up over years was crumbling in months. And in these cracks my shadow peeked out. I remained in the shadows. Never openly. I would not have gone for glory. My victory was their inner rupture, their loss of their own greatness. I did not ask for apologies, did not expect awards. It was enough for me to see them learn at the cost of pain. And when they looked up, they no longer looked at me with contempt. They looked at the one who had hurt them, and knew they were to blame. The diary now had other entries: Elena, lone failure, 0706, Mikhail, scandal in the industry, 1206, Anya, refusal to finance, 1907. This is not a stone in the hands of revenge, it is a list of lessons taught in pain. I learned not to rush into battle. I learned to win when no one is watching. And this is the scariest thing for those who are used to bragging about their success in public. Because the shadow is also a force, if it is directed correctly. There are now other entries in the diary: Elena, lone failure, 0706, Mikhailu, scandal in the industry, 1206, Anya, refusal to finance, 1907. This is not a stone in the hands of revenge, it is a list of lessons taught in pain. I learned not to rush into battle. I learned to win when no one is watching. And this is the scariest thing for those who are used to bragging about their success in public. Because the shadow is also a force, if it is directed correctly. There are now other entries in the diary: Elena, lone failure, 0706, Mikhailu, scandal in the industry, 1206, Anya, refusal to finance, 1907. This is not a stone in the hands of revenge, it is a list of lessons taught in pain. I learned not to rush into battle. I learned to win when no one is watching. And this is the scariest thing for those who are used to bragging about their success in public. Because the shadow is also a force, if it is directed correctly. They say people change with age. Maybe. But I've learned to see change differently. It's a process of purification, when the superfluous falls away by itself, and only what matters remains. In my case, all that remained was dignity. Not the loud one that demands applause, but the quiet knowledge of one's limits. I wasn't looking for revenge for the sake of satisfaction, I wanted to restore balance, to make them see me again, not as a useless thing, but as a person who mattered. And if that balance required pain, it hurt from the side where indifference had once been. When everything began to fall apart, I didn't stand on top and enjoy the view. No, watching was hard. I saw their faces turn pale with emotion in the morning, how the calls didn't bring comfort, how they lost their footing. But in the midst of this chaos, something new was being born: respect, even if it hurt. My daughter, who used to run away, now stayed overnight. The son who spoke coldly finally stopped and listened. They didn't come all at once, and not all of them. But those who stayed came in different ways. I saw shame appear in their eyes, then compassion, then a desire to make amends. And it wasn't because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted them to feel that their indifference had consequences. So that they would understand, people are not infinite. Society also changed its approach. That small town where we shared life together stopped turning away from old age so confidently. Maybe my game was small and selfish, but its effect was visible. People began to look more closely, simple habits became kinder. Saleswomen were asked, "How are you?" without irony. Doctors stopped for a minute longer. A small change, but an important one. My revenge, if you can call it that, taught people that ignoring is also an action with its consequences. I did not become a saint. I am alien to pathetic conclusions. I did not go for any high-quality recognition, I had no desire to triumph. I remained the same lonely man in a small house, but with a different inner world, sharp, cold and completely in control. I no longer cried simply from resentment. I saw power differently, not as power over others, but as power over being noticed. And when I began to be noticed, I felt that my mission was accomplished. The diary, which had once been a place of complaints and pain, was now a sheet of lessons. I wrote down not only their mistakes, but also my observations, how people react to pressure, where weakness lurks that can heal. And at the end of each day, I asked myself, have I changed anything in myself? Have I become better? The answer was vague. I did not become better in the classical sense, I became different. Perhaps older, wiser in the ways of survival. Perhaps colder. But I kept my dignity, and that was the main thing. When they came to me with eyes full of remorse, I didn't celebrate their downfalls. I listened. Sometimes I said a word or two. Sometimes I just kept quiet. After all, the greatest payback is when people see themselves as they really are. No one wanted to turn back time. No one asked for everything that their attitude had stolen. All they asked for was a chance to be better. I gave it to them, but not as a gift, as a test of whether they are able to bear the consequences of their actions and learn. I have lost a lot. But sometimes loss opens up space for something else to grow. My other is a silence that does not hide weakness, but reveals strength. I do not seek forgiveness. I do not seek revenge in its crudest form. My revenge is a lesson, and my lesson is a rule: do not treat people as if their dignity depends on their usefulness. Old age has power not only in memories of the past, but in the ability to demand respect here and now. When the sun sets and I close my diary, I make a final entry, not a reproach, not a sentence. Just a phrase to remind me of who I am and who I have become. Never become someone who can simply be left. The best and most accurate revenge is living dignity. Lucas, 0309. Subscribe and like, and send the video to your friends.